Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Sometimes the only way we survive these stories is by knowing we're not alone. The morning of my mother's funeral arrived gray and heavy, the kind of gray that feels pressed against your chest. I remember standing in front of the bathroom mirror, my black dress hanging too loose on my shoulders because grief had stolen my appetite weeks ago. My eyes looked older than they were, rimmed red, swollen from nights of crying into a pillow that still smelled faintly like her lavender lotion. I whispered, "Just get through today," the way she used to tell me before doctor's appointments or difficult conversations. My mother always believed you could survive anything if you took it 1 hour at a time. The drive to the cemetery was quiet. My husband, Daniel, sat beside me with both hands on the steering wheel, his jaw set, eyes forward. He hadn't said much since my mother passed. At first, I mistook his silence for respect. Later, I would understand it was calculation. The radio was off, and the hum of the road filled the space where comfort should have been. I wanted him to reach for my hand. I wanted some sign that we were still a team, but his fingers never moved. My mother had raised me alone after my father died when I was 12. She worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, and still found the energy to sit on the edge of my bed at night, brushing my hair and telling me stories about strong women who survived storms. She taught me to read contracts before signing them, to keep copies of important papers, and to never let anyone make me feel small during my most vulnerable moments. Standing at her funeral, surrounded by folded chairs and damp grass, I felt like a child again, desperate for her voice, her steady presence. People came up to me one by one, offering condolences, hugging me gently as if I might break. I thanked them, nodded, smiled when appropriate. Grief has a way of putting you on autopilot. Daniel stood slightly apart, accepting handshakes, his expression carefully neutral. I noticed how he checked his watch more than once, how he kept adjusting the knot of his tie. At the time, I thought he was uncomfortable with emotions. I didn't realize he was counting minutes. When the service ended and the casket was lowered, my knees nearly gave out. I clutched the edge of my chair, my breath coming in shallow bursts. That was when Daniel stepped closer. For a moment, relief washed over me. Maybe now, I thought. Maybe now he would hold me. Instead, he leaned in and said quietly, "We need to talk." "Not now," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Please, not today." He nodded, but there was something cold in his eyes, something resolved. As people began to disperse, he gently guided me a few steps away from the others, near a row of bare trees. My hands were still shaking when he pressed a manila envelope into them. "What is this?" I asked, confused, my mascara streaking as fresh tears fell. "You'll want to read it when you're alone," he said, his voice steady, almost polite. Then, after a pause that felt cruelly deliberate, he added, "But it's time." I looked down at the envelope, my name neatly typed on the front. A strange numbness crept up my arms. I opened it slowly, the paper inside rustling far too loudly in the quiet cemetery. The words blurred at first, but then they sharpened into something I couldn't escape. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Divorce papers. Served. At my mother's funeral. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The world tilted, the gravestones swaying as if they were made of water. I looked up at Daniel, waiting for him to say this was a mistake, a misunderstanding, some sick joke. He didn't. He just watched me, his face unreadable. "You couldn't wait?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Please, not today." He nodded, but there was something cold in his eyes, something resolved. As people began to disperse, he gently guided me a few steps away from the others, near a row of bare trees. My hands were still shaking when he pressed a manila envelope into them. "What is this?" I asked, confused, my mascara streaking as fresh tears fell. "You'll want to read it when you're alone," he said, his voice steady, almost polite. Then, after a pause that felt cruelly deliberate, he added, "But it's time." I looked down at the envelope, my name neatly typed on the front. A strange numbness crept up my arms. I opened it slowly, the paper inside rustling far too loudly in the quiet cemetery. The words blurred at first, but then they sharpened into something I couldn't escape. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Divorce papers. Served. At my mother's funeral. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The world tilted, the gravestones swaying as if they were made of water. I looked up at Daniel, waiting for him to say this was a mistake, a misunderstanding, some sick joke. He didn't. He just watched me, his face unreadable. "You couldn't wait?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Please, not today." He nodded, but there was something cold in his eyes, something resolved. As people began to disperse, he gently guided me a few steps away from the others, near a row of bare trees. My hands were still shaking when he pressed a manila envelope into them. "What is this?" I asked, confused, my mascara streaking as fresh tears fell. "You'll want to read it when you're alone," he said, his voice steady, almost polite. Then, after a pause that felt cruelly deliberate, he added, "But it's time." I looked down at the envelope, my name neatly typed on the front. A strange numbness crept up my arms. I opened it slowly, the paper inside rustling far too loudly in the quiet cemetery. The words blurred at first, but then they sharpened into something I couldn't escape. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Divorce papers. Served. At my mother's funeral. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The world tilted, the gravestones swaying as if they were made of water. I looked up at Daniel, waiting for him to say this was a mistake, a misunderstanding, some sick joke. He didn't. He just watched me, his face unreadable. "You couldn't wait?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Please, not today." He nodded, but there was something cold in his eyes, something resolved. As people began to disperse, he gently guided me a few steps away from the others, near a row of bare trees. My hands were still shaking when he pressed a manila envelope into them. "What is this?" I asked, confused, my mascara streaking as fresh tears fell. "You'll want to read it when you're alone," he said, his voice steady, almost polite. Then, after a pause that felt cruelly deliberate, he added, "But it's time." I looked down at the envelope, my name neatly typed on the front. A strange numbness crept up my arms. I opened it slowly, the paper inside rustling far too loudly in the quiet cemetery. The words blurred at first, but then they sharpened into something I couldn't escape. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Divorce papers. Served. At my mother's funeral. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The world tilted, the gravestones swaying as if they were made of water. I looked up at Daniel, waiting for him to say this was a mistake, a misunderstanding, some sick joke. He didn't. He just watched me, his face unreadable. "You couldn't wait?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Please, not today." He nodded, but there was something cold in his eyes, something resolved. As people began to disperse, he gently guided me a few steps away from the others, near a row of bare trees. My hands were still shaking when he pressed a manila envelope into them. "What is this?" I asked, confused, my mascara streaking as fresh tears fell. "You'll want to read it when you're alone," he said, his voice steady, almost polite. Then, after a pause that felt cruelly deliberate, he added, "But it's time." I looked down at the envelope, my name neatly typed on the front. A strange numbness crept up my arms. I opened it slowly, the paper inside rustling far too loudly in the quiet cemetery. The words blurred at first, but then they sharpened into something I couldn't escape. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Divorce papers. Served. at my mother's funeral. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The world tilted, the gravestones swaying as if they were made of water. I looked up at Daniel, waiting for him to say this was a mistake, a misunderstanding, some sick joke. He didn't. He just watched me, his face unreadable. "You couldn't wait?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Please, not today." He nodded, but there was something cold in his eyes, something resolved. As people began to disperse, he gently guided me a few steps away from the others, near a row of bare trees. My hands were still shaking when he pressed a manila envelope into them. "What is this?" I asked, confused, my mascara streaking as fresh tears fell. "You'll want to read it when you're alone," he said, his voice steady, almost polite. Then, after a pause that felt cruelly deliberate, That night, sleep never really came. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, listening to Daniel move around the house as if nothing had changed. Cabinets opened, water ran. He even hummed at one point, some absent-minded tune that made my stomach twist. I wondered how a man could hum on the same day he served his wife divorce papers at her mother's funeral. But grief teaches you quickly that cruelty doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it wears a calm face and goes about its routine. Sometime after midnight, he knocked on the bedroom door. Not gently, just a firm, practical knock, like a landlord checking in on a tenant. "Claire," he said through the door, "we should probably talk logistics tomorrow." I didn't answer. My phone was clutched in my hand, Margaret's number still glowing on the screen like a small lifeline. I was replaying her words in my head. "Do not sign anything. We need to talk." I didn't know yet what she could do, but knowing someone was on my side made the house feel less hostile. The next morning, Daniel acted almost cheerful. He made coffee, offered me a cup as if we were still a normal couple sharing a normal kitchen. I declined and watched him from the doorway, noticing details I'd ignored before. The way he avoided my eyes, the way his shoulders seemed lighter, as if a burden had been lifted from him. "I'll be out most of the day," he said casually, "meeting with my lawyer again, just to keep things moving." Of course he was. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As soon as he left, I locked the door behind him and slid down against it, my breath shaky. Then I stood up, wiped my face, and called Margaret back. She asked me to come to her office that afternoon. "Bring everything," she said. "Bank statements, mortgage papers, anything you can find. And most importantly, bring yourself. We'll take this one step at a time." Her office was small, lined with shelves of thick legal books and framed photos of smiling families. She looked older than I remembered, her hair completely silver now, but her eyes were sharp, alert. When she hugged me, it was brief but solid, the kind of hug that said, "You're safe here." As I handed her the divorce papers, she read them slowly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "She picked his moment," she said finally, "and he's banking on you being too overwhelmed to fight." I swallowed. "Is he right?" She looked at me over the top of her glasses. "Only if you let him be." For the next 2 hours, we went through everything, every sacrifice I'd made, the time I took off work to care for my mother, the money my mother contributed to the down payment of the house, the joint accounts Daniel claimed were mostly his. Margaret asked careful, precise questions, scribbling notes as I answered. With each detail, something inside me shifted. I stopped feeling like a victim of circumstances and started feeling like a witness to the truth. "He didn't disclose some of this," she said at one point, tapping the papers, "and that's interesting." "Interesting how?" I asked. "Interesting enough that I think he's overplaying his hand. Claire, your husband assumes you're grieving too deeply to push back. He assumes you don't remember what you're entitled to, and he assumes you don't have legal representation." I let out a shaky laugh. "Well, he's wrong about that last part." Margaret smiled slightly. "Yes, he is." When I got home, Daniel was already there. He looked up from his phone as I walked in, his eyebrows lifting in mild surprise. "You were out," he said. "I figured you'd need the day to rest." "I met with a lawyer," I replied calmly. The change in his face was immediate, a flicker of irritation, quickly masked. "You don't need to do that. It'll just complicate things." I think serving me divorce papers at my mother's funeral already did that. He exhaled sharply and set his phone down. "Look, Claire, let's be adults about this. I'm not trying to hurt you." I almost laughed. Instead, I said, "Then why did you choose that moment?" He didn't answer. He stood up, straightening his shirt as if preparing for a meeting. "My lawyer said we should keep communication minimal. Anything you need to say can go through them." "Fine. Mine will be in touch." For the first time since the funeral, he looked unsettled, not angry, not dismissive, unsettled. He nodded once and walked out of the room. The days that followed were strange, suspended. We moved around each other like polite strangers. I slept in the guest room. I ate small meals when I could stomach them. Grief came in waves, sometimes triggered by something as simple as seeing my mother's favorite mug in the cabinet. But along with the grief was a growing sense of clarity. I started remembering things, conversations Daniel thought I'd forgotten, comments he made about finances, about what's his and what's fair. Margaret called me regularly with updates. "He didn't expect us to push back on the house," she said one afternoon, "and he definitely didn't expect the documentation about your mother's contribution." I told him there was nothing unfair in the papers. I said bitterly, "Of course he did. People who benefit from unfairness often believe it's perfectly reasonable." Then came the first mediation meeting. Daniel arrived with his lawyer, a younger man with an expensive suit and a practiced smile. Daniel barely looked at me as we sat across the table from them. I noticed how confident he seemed, how relaxed. He still believed he had the upper hand. Margaret was calm, methodical. She laid out our position clearly, citing documents, dates, numbers. I watched Daniel's expression change inch by inch as she spoke. His lawyer interrupted once, twice, trying to steer the conversation back in their favor. Margaret didn't flinch. "And there's one more thing," she said, near the end, sliding a folder across the table. Daniel stiffened. "What account?" he asked. "The one opened 18 months ago," Margaret replied evenly, "in your name only, with a balance that doesn't align with your stated income." The room went quiet. I stared at Daniel, my heart pounding. He looked at his lawyer, confusion flashing across his face, followed by something closer to panic. That's nothing," he said. "Just savings." "Which should have been disclosed," Margaret said, "especially in a divorce proceeding." His lawyer leaned toward him, whispering urgently. Daniel's jaw tightened. For the first time, he looked at me directly, really looked at me, and I saw it then. Regret. Not for hurting me, not for choosing the worst possible moment, but for underestimating me. The mediation ended without resolution. As we stood to leave, Daniel pulled me aside. "You didn't have to do this," he said quietly, his voice tight. "Neither did you," I replied. That night, alone in the guest room, I thought about my mother again, about how she taught me that strength isn't loud. It doesn't need an audience. It shows up when you refuse to be erased, even when you're exhausted, even when you're grieving. Daniel thought my grief would make me pliable. Instead, it had stripped away my fear. The legal process dragged on for weeks. There were emails, phone calls, revised proposals. Each time Daniel tried to push for more, Margaret pushed back harder. She uncovered inconsistencies, omissions, small lies that added up to a clear picture. He had been planning his exit while I was planning hospital visits and funeral arrangements, and now that plan was unraveling. One afternoon, Margaret called me with a tone I hadn't heard before, satisfaction. "She's requesting another meeting," she said. "This time he's more flexible." I closed my eyes and breathed out slowly. "What does that mean?" "It means," she said, "that he's starting to realize this isn't going the way he imagined." When I hung up, I sat quietly for a long time. I still missed my mother fiercely. There were moments I wanted to call her, to tell her everything, to hear her laugh softly and say, "I knew you'd handle it." But there was comfort, too, in knowing that the lessons she gave me were alive, working through me, guiding me forward. Daniel served me divorce papers at my mother's funeral because he thought grief had made me weak. He was wrong. Grief had reminded me who I was, and he was just beginning to understand the cost of that mistake. The second mediation meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning, and I woke up that day with a strange steadiness in my chest. Not peace exactly, more like readiness, the kind you feel before stepping onto unfamiliar ground, knowing there's no turning back. I dressed carefully, not to impress Daniel, but to remind myself who I was outside of him. A soft gray blouse, my mother's silver necklace resting against my collarbone. She used to say that carrying a piece of someone you love can give you courage when your own feels thin. Daniel arrived late. I noticed it immediately. The first meeting, he'd been early, confident, relaxed. This time, he rushed in, tie slightly crooked, his lawyer trailing behind him with a tight expression. They didn't look like men in control anymore. They looked like men reacting. Margaret greeted them politely and wasted no time. "We've reviewed your revised proposal," she said, folding her hands on the table. "It's a step in the right direction, but it still doesn't reflect an equitable division." Daniel sighed, rubbing his temples. "What do you want?" he asked, the irritation in his voice barely contained. I spoke before Margaret could. "I want fairness," I said, "not what's convenient for you, not what you think I'll accept because I'm tired." He looked at me sharply. "I never said—" "You didn't have to," I replied. "Your timing said it for you." There was a pause. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. His lawyer cleared his throat and launched into a rehearsed explanation about compromises and moving forward. I listened quietly, noticing how often Daniel avoided my gaze. When Margaret countered with numbers and documents, his confidence eroded further. "And there's another matter we haven't discussed," Margaret said calmly. "The funds transferred from the joint account last year, shortly before Claire's mother became ill." Daniel stiffened. "That was for expenses. For an apartment lease in your name with a 12-month term?" Margaret asked. My stomach dropped, not from surprise, from confirmation. So that was it. The late nights, the sudden interest in separating finances. He hadn't just planned to leave, he'd prepared a place to land. Daniel's lawyer leaned in, whispering furiously. Daniel's face flushed. "That's not relevant," he snapped. "Then it's relevant to intent and disclosure." The mediator raised a hand, trying to regain control of the conversation, but the balance had already shifted. Daniel wasn't steering anymore. He was scrambling. After 2 tense hours, the meeting ended again without resolution. But this time, the tone was different. There was no smugness as Daniel gathered his things, no dismissive glance in my direction. Instead, there was something tight and brittle about him, like a man realizing the ground beneath his feet wasn't as solid as he believed. In the hallway, he stopped me. "We need to talk," he said quietly. I looked at Margaret. She gave a small nod and stepped a few feet away. "This is getting out of hand," Daniel said. "You're dragging up things that don't matter." "They matter to me, and they matter legally." He exhaled sharply. "You're not the person you used to be." I studied his face, searching for the man I married, the man who once promised to stand by me no matter what. "No," I said, "I'm the person I always was. You just didn't think I'd show up like this." He shook his head, frustration etched into every line. "I didn't want this to be a war." "Then you shouldn't have ambushed me at my mother's funeral," I said softly. That did it. His expression cracked, just for a second. Guilt flickered there, quickly buried. "I didn't think. You thought. You just didn't care how it would affect me." We stood there in silence, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the space between us. Finally, he turned away. "Have your lawyer call mine," he said flatly. In the weeks that followed, the truth continued to surface. Margaret uncovered more inconsistencies, undisclosed bonuses, emails suggesting Daniel planned to pressure me into signing quickly. Each discovery felt like peeling back another layer of a life I thought I understood. It hurt, yes, but it also clarified. I stopped wondering what I'd done wrong and started seeing what he'd done deliberately. One evening, I returned home to find a package on the porch. Inside was a box of my mother's things that Daniel had apparently decided to sort through. Her scarves, old photographs, letters she'd written me over the years. My hands trembled as I held them, anger and grief colliding in my chest. He hadn't asked, he hadn't considered that these were sacred to me, just another boundary crossed. I called Margaret the next morning, my voice shaking. She listened quietly, then said, "This pattern matters. It shows disregard. Keep documenting everything." Documenting, that word became my anchor. I kept a notebook by my bed, writing down dates, conversations, actions. It was exhausting, but it gave me a sense of control. Each entry was a reminder that my experience was real, that it mattered. The next legal meeting wasn't mediation, it was a hearing. Daniel's request for temporary exclusive use of the house was being considered. The same house my mother helped me buy, the same house he claimed was mostly his. As we sat in the courtroom, I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. The judge listened attentively as both sides presented their arguments. Daniel's lawyer painted me as emotionally unstable, overwhelmed with grief, incapable of maintaining the property alone. The words stung, even though I knew they were strategic. When Margaret spoke, her voice was calm but firm. She presented evidence of my financial contributions, my stable employment, my caregiving history. She spoke of my mother's investment, of Daniel's undisclosed assets, of the apartment lease. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't dramatize, she let the facts speak. The judge leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. Then he looked directly at Daniel. "Mr. Harris," he said, "given the circumstances and the lack of full disclosure, I'm denying your request. The house will remain shared for now, with primary residence granted to Mrs. Harris." My breath caught. Daniel's shoulders slumped. His lawyer whispered urgently, but it was too late. For the first time since the funeral, something tangible shifted in my favor. Outside the courtroom, Daniel avoided me entirely. Margaret squeezed my arm gently. "This is just one step, but it's an important one." That night, I sat alone in the living room, surrounded by memories. The couch where my mother slept during her last visits, the window she loved to sit near watching the birds in the morning. I placed her letters on the coffee table and read one aloud, her handwriting looping and familiar. She wrote about resilience, about trusting yourself when others doubt you. Tears streamed down my face, but they weren't only tears of pain, there was pride there too. Daniel moved out temporarily a few days later. He packed quickly, efficiently, as if to erase his presence. I watched from the doorway as he carried the last box to his car. He paused, turning back towards the house. "I never thought it would go like this," he said quietly. "I never did either," I replied, "but here we are." He nodded once, then left. The door closed behind him with a finality that echoed through the house. I stood there for a long moment, letting the silence settle. It felt different now, not oppressive, open. I knew the divorce wasn't over. There were still negotiations ahead, still emotions to process. But something fundamental had changed. He no longer held the power he thought he did. He no longer controlled the narrative. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I touched my mother's necklace and whispered a thank you into the quiet, for her lessons, for her strength, for teaching me that even in the deepest grief, you don't have to surrender your voice. Daniel served me divorce papers at my mother's funeral because he believed grief would silence me. Instead, it taught me how to speak. The house felt different once Daniel left. Not empty exactly, but quieter in a way that allowed my thoughts to stretch out instead of curling inward. For the first time since my mother died, I slept through the night. No dreams, no sudden jolts awake, just a deep, heavy rest that left me sore but grounded when I woke. Grief still sat with me, but it no longer felt crowded by tension. I spent that morning opening windows, letting fresh air move through rooms that had held too much unspoken resentment. I brewed coffee and drank it slowly at the kitchen table, the same table where Daniel once told me he felt trapped, the same table where my mother had laughed softly while telling me I deserved more than I ever settled for. At the time, I thought she was talking about career ambitions. Now I knew better. Margaret called mid-morning. Daniel's attorney reached out, she said. They want to revisit settlement discussions. I wasn't surprised. Losing the temporary use of the house had rattled him. Control, once shaken, tends to make people impatient. What are they offering? I asked. A more balanced division of assets. Still not ideal, but it shows movement. Then let's keep pushing, I said. I'm done compromising just to keep the peace. Margaret chuckled softly. Your mother would be proud. That afternoon, I drove to my mother's house. I hadn't been back since the funeral. Walking through the door felt like stepping into a preserved moment. Her slippers by the couch, the faint scent of lavender still lingering. I sat on her bed and let myself cry freely, without fear of being overheard or judged. When the tears eased, I opened her nightstand drawer and found the folder she always kept there. Inside were copies of important documents, neatly labeled, and a handwritten note addressed to me. It read, Claire, if you're reading this, I'm probably gone. Remember what I taught you. Ask questions, protect yourself, and never let grief make your decisions for you. I love you more than words. My hands shook as I folded the note and slipped it into my bag. The timing felt uncanny, like she'd known exactly when I'd need those words most. The next legal meeting was scheduled for the following week. In the days leading up to it, Daniel became more communicative. Emails, texts, polite inquiries about logistics. It was a stark contrast to his earlier detachment. I responded only through Margaret, maintaining the boundaries she'd advised. Each time his name appeared on my phone, my chest tightened, but I reminded myself that this discomfort was temporary. Capitulation would be permanent. The meeting itself took place in a conference room with large windows overlooking the city. Daniel looked tired. His suit hung looser, his eyes shadowed. His lawyer did most of the talking, presenting a revised settlement that finally acknowledged my contributions, my mother's investment, and a fair split of assets. They even conceded on the house, proposing that I keep it in exchange for refinancing. Margaret reviewed the document carefully, then leaned toward me. This is reasonable, she whispered. Not perfect, but fair. I looked across the table at Daniel. For a moment, I saw not my adversary, but a man unraveling under the weight of his own choices. I agree, I said, with one condition. He looked up sharply. What condition? I want a written acknowledgement, I said calmly, that the timing of the divorce papers was inappropriate and caused emotional distress. His lawyer frowned. That's unnecessary. It's necessary to me, I replied, and I'm prepared to continue this process if it's not included. The room went quiet. Daniel stared at me, disbelief flickering across his face. You want an apology? He asked incredulously. I want accountability, I said. There's a difference. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. After a long moment, he nodded. Fine, he said. Put it in. Margaret's eyes met mine, a subtle nod of approval. The revised document was drafted, reviewed, and signed later that day. As I placed my signature on the final page, a wave of exhaustion washed over me, followed by relief. It wasn't triumph. It was closure. When the divorce was finalized weeks later, I felt oddly calm. There was no celebration, no dramatic release, just a quiet acknowledgement that a chapter had ended. I spent that evening alone, lighting a candle for my mother and sitting in the living room reflecting on how much it changed in such a short time. Daniel sent one last message after everything was settled. I didn't expect it. "I never meant to hurt you the way I did. I thought being decisive would make it easier. I was wrong." I stared at the screen for a long time before responding. Then I typed, "Healing doesn't come from decisiveness. It comes from compassion. I wish you well." And I meant it, not because he deserved absolution, but because I deserved peace. In the months that followed, I focused on rebuilding, not just my finances or routines, but my sense of self. I took a short leave from work and traveled to a small coastal town my mother loved. I walked along the shore in the early mornings, letting the rhythm of the waves steady my thoughts. I wrote in a journal, pouring out feelings I'd suppressed for years. One afternoon, sitting on a bench overlooking the water, I realized something that stopped me cold. I wasn't angry anymore. The betrayal still hurt, but it no longer defined me. Daniel's actions were part of my story, but they weren't the ending. When I returned home, I began making changes to the house. Not renovations, but small shifts. New curtains, a different arrangement of furniture. I planted flowers in the garden my mother once tended. Each change felt like a declaration. This space is mine now. Friends who had quietly worried about me began to notice the difference. "You seem lighter," one said over coffee. "I am," I replied. I finally stopped carrying what wasn't mine to bear. Looking back, I understand now that Daniel served me divorce papers at my mother's funeral because he believed grief would make me compliant. He thought my loss would eclipse my clarity. But grief didn't erase my strength. It sharpened it. It reminded me of the woman my mother raised, the values she instilled, the voice she insisted I never silence. If there's one lesson I carry forward, it's this. People will sometimes choose your weakest moment to show you who they really are. When that happens, believe them, and then choose yourself anyway. Life has a strange way of continuing even after the ground beneath you splits open. At first, every day after the divorce felt like walking through a house after a storm, carefully stepping around debris, unsure what was still standing. But slowly, without any dramatic announcement, routines began to form again. Morning coffee, evening walks, phone calls with friends I'd unintentionally pushed away during my marriage. The quiet no longer scared me. It held me. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, I received a call from Margaret. Her voice carried a seriousness that made me sit down immediately. "There's something you should know," she said. "It doesn't affect the settlement, but I believe you deserve the truth." My stomach tightened. "What is it?" "Daniel's former lawyer contacted me. They're no longer representing him. Apparently, there were ethical disagreements." I closed my eyes. About what? "About information Daniel failed to disclose until the very end," she said gently, "including why he was in such a rush to divorce you when he did." The room seemed to tilt. "What do you mean?" Margaret paused, choosing her words carefully. "Claire, your husband wasn't just planning to leave. He was about to lose his job." The silence that followed felt louder than any noise. "Lose his job?" I repeated. "Yes," she said. "An internal investigation, financial irregularities. Nothing criminal, but enough that he knew his income and reputation were about to take a hit. He wanted the divorce finalized before that happened." I felt something click into place. The urgency, the timing, the cruelty of choosing my mother's funeral. He wasn't just exploiting my grief. He was racing his own consequences. "So," I said slowly, He thought if I divorced me quickly, I wouldn't be entitled to whatever fallout came next. Exactly, Margaret replied. And because you didn't sign, because you challenged him, the final settlement actually protected you from the worst of it. When the call ended, I sat in stunned stillness. I didn't feel satisfaction, I felt clarity, the kind that strips away lingering self-doubt. Daniel didn't leave because I wasn't enough. He left because he was afraid of accountability, afraid of standing beside someone while his carefully constructed image cracked. A few weeks later, I ran into Daniel by chance at the grocery store. I almost didn't recognize him. He looked thinner, older somehow. When our eyes met, surprise flickered across his face, followed by something like resignation. "Claire," he said awkwardly. "Daniel," I replied calmly. We stood there between the cereal aisle and the dairy section, two people who once shared a life, now reduced to polite familiarity. He shifted his weight. "You look well." "I am," I said honestly. "I hope you are too." He hesitated, then sighed. "I heard you spoke to Margaret recently." "I did," I said. He looked down at his hands. "She told you, didn't she?" "Yes," I said, "she did." For a moment he said nothing. Then, quietly, "I didn't know how to tell you. Everything was falling apart at once. And you decided the best way to handle that was to hurt me when I was already grieving," I said, not accusing, just stating fact. He flinched. "I know. I live with that." I studied his face, searching the anger I thought I'd feel. It wasn't there. "I hope you learned from it," I said. "That's all I can say." As I walked away, my heart felt light, unburdened. I realized I didn't need him to suffer to feel vindicated. His regret was his to carry. That evening, I went home and opened my mother's letters again. I read them slowly, savoring her words. She wrote about mistakes she made in her own life, about men who underestimated her, about the importance of self-respect. In one letter, she wrote, "The hardest lesson is learning that love without respect will always cost you something." I understood that now in a way I never had before. Months passed, the seasons changed. I hosted my first holiday gathering alone, inviting friends who brought laughter and warmth into the house. I cooked too much food, just like my mother used to, and smiled at the familiar chaos. At one point, I caught myself laughing freely, without restraint, and had to step into the kitchen to wipe away tears, not of sadness, of gratitude. I began volunteering at a local grief support group, sharing my story with others navigating loss and betrayal. I never told it for sympathy. I told it to remind them and myself that grief doesn't disqualify you from strength. If anything, it reveals it. One evening, after a meeting, a woman approached me. Her eyes were red, her hands trembling. "My husband left thee right after my father died," she whispered. "I thought it meant I was weak." I took her hands in mine. "It doesn't," I said firmly. "It means he showed you who he was when you needed him most." She nodded slowly, as if something inside her had shifted. On the anniversary of my mother's death, I visited her grave alone. I brought fresh flowers and stood quietly, letting memories wash over me. I told her everything, about the divorce, about the house, about finding my footing again. The wind rustled the trees, and for a moment I felt her presence so strongly it took my breath away. "I'm okay," I whispered. "You taught me how to be." As I turned to leave, I realized something profound. Daniel serving me divorce papers at my mother's funeral wasn't the end of my story. It was the moment the truth surfaced, the moment I stopped shrinking to accommodate someone else's fear, the moment I chose myself fully, without apology. If you're listening to this and you're in the middle of grief, betrayal, or both, hear this clearly. Your pain does not make you powerless. Your heartbreak does not erase your worth. And anyone who tries to take advantage of your lowest moment is revealing their own weakness, not yours. I didn't win because my husband regretted his choices. I won because I remembered who I was when it mattered most. And that, more than any legal victory, is something no one can ever take from me. After everything settled, after the paperwork was filed and the house finally felt like mine in a way it never had before, I thought the hardest part was behind me. I was wrong. The quiet aftermath was its own kind of reckoning. When the noise of conflict fades, you're left alone with the truth of what you tolerated, what you ignored, and what you survived. That's where the real work began. I started therapy at Margaret's gentle insistence. Legal closure isn't the same as emotional closure, she told me. You've been in survival mode. It's time to process. I didn't argue. I knew she was right. In those early sessions, I talked about my mother far more than I talked about Daniel, about how safe I always felt with her, about how I mistook familiarity for security in my marriage. My therapist listened without interruption, then said something that stayed with me. Sometimes, she said, we marry people who feel familiar, not because they're safe, but because we've learned how to survive around them. That sentence sat heavy in my chest for days. I replayed moments from my marriage with new eyes, the way Daniel dismissed my concerns, the way I learned to soften my voice to avoid conflict, the way I convinced myself that love meant endurance. None of it had felt dramatic at the time. It felt normal. That realization hurt more than the divorce itself. Around this time, something unexpected happened. Daniel's sister, Emily, reached out to me. We hadn't spoken since the funeral. I debated whether to respond, my finger hovering over the screen for a long moment before finally typing back. We agreed to meet for coffee. She looked nervous when she arrived, twisting her napkin between her fingers. I didn't know how to face you, she admitted. What he did was unforgivable. I studied her face, searching for defensiveness. There was none, only regret. Why now? I asked gently. Because I finally see the pattern, she said, and I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. She told me things I suspected but never confirmed, that Daniel had always struggled with accountability, that he avoided uncomfortable conversations until they exploded, that serving me divorce papers at my mother's funeral wasn't impulsive, it was consistent with who he'd always been, just magnified by pressure. He tried to tell him it was wrong, she said quietly. He wouldn't listen. I know. And strangely, I meant more than just that moment. I meant all of it. He had never listened, not really. When we parted, Emily hugged me tightly. You didn't deserve any of it, she said. I know. And that simple statement felt like progress. Not long after that, I received a letter in the mail, handwritten. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. Daniel's. I considered throwing it away unopened. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table and carefully unfolded the paper. He wrote about losing his job, about struggling financially, about realizing too late how much damage he'd caused. He apologized again, this time with more words, more explanation, but something about it felt different, not manipulative, just tired, worn down by consequences he could no longer outrun. At the end, he wrote, I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to know I finally understand why you fought back. You were braver than I ever was. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer with other remnants of a past life. I didn't feel the need to respond. Understanding didn't require engagement. Some things are acknowledged internally and left there. As the year moved on, I found myself changing in small but noticeable ways. I stopped apologizing unnecessarily. I stopped explaining myself to people committed to misunderstanding me. I took space, literally and figuratively. I rearranged the living room to create a reading corner. I signed up for a class I'd always wanted to take but never did because Daniel thought it was impractical. One evening, as I sat reading by the window, I realized something else. I wasn't afraid of being alone anymore. Loneliness and solitude had stopped feeling like the same thing. Solitude felt like choice. Loneliness had felt like erasure. On what would have been my wedding anniversary, I did something symbolic. I woke up early, drove to the coast, and watched the sun rise. I brought my mother's necklace with me as the sky shifted from dark to gold. I didn't mourn the wedding that day. I honored the version of myself who survived it. Later that afternoon, I hosted a small dinner, just close friends, no speeches, no heavy conversations. At one point, someone raised a glass and said, "To Claire for reminding us what resilience looks like." I smiled, feeling warmth spread through my chest. Resilience, not bitterness, not revenge, just resilience. As word of my story spread quietly through friends and acquaintances, people began reaching out, not for gossip, but for guidance. A coworker confided that her husband was trying to pressure her into signing documents she didn't understand. A neighbor admitted she felt trapped in a marriage she no longer recognized. I never told them what to do. I just listened, and when appropriate, I said the same thing every time. Take your time, ask questions, and don't let anyone rush you when you're hurting. Those words felt like an inheritance from my mother passed through me to others. One night, long after everyone else had gone to bed, I stood in the hallway looking at a photo of my mother and I from years ago. We were laughing, our heads tilted toward each other. I touched the frame lightly and whispered, "You saved me." Not from Daniel exactly, but from the version of myself who would have signed those papers in silence. Because that's the part people don't talk about enough. Betrayal doesn't come from others. It comes from the moments we're tempted to betray ourselves to keep the peace. I almost did that. Almost signed away my voice, my stability, my future, because I was tired and grieving and wanted the pain to stop. But grief didn't break me. It clarified me. My husband served me divorce papers at my mother's funeral, thinking it would end things quickly, quietly, in his favor. But what he didn't understand was that grief stripped away my fear of conflict. It reminded me that life is too fragile to live on your knees. I didn't come out of this story unscathed. I came out wiser, stronger, more honest with myself than I had ever been. And if there's one thing I know for certain now, it's this. When someone tries to take advantage of your lowest moment, they're handing you a choice. You can shrink or you can rise. I chose to rise. By the time the second year after the divorce rolled around, my life no longer felt like something I was recovering. It felt like something I was actively living. That distinction mattered more than I ever expected. Recovery implies damage as the central truth. Living implies agency, choice, direction. I woke up one morning and realized Daniel was no longer the first thought in my head, or even the second. Some days he didn't appear at all. That realization didn't come with fireworks. It arrived quietly, disguised as a normal Tuesday. I was watering the plants in the garden my mother once tended, humming to myself when it hit me. I was content. Not numb, not distracted, content. And for a long time, I just stood there, hose in hand, letting that feeling settle into my bones. Around that time, I received an invitation I hadn't expected. It was from my cousin Leela, someone I'd drifted away from during my marriage without ever fully understanding why. She was hosting a small family reunion and wanted me there. I hesitated at first. Family gatherings had always been complicated, and part of me still carried the residue of shame I didn't consciously choose, but had absorbed anyway. Divorce has a way of making you feel like a public failure, even when it shouldn't. But something inside me said, go. So I did. The reunion was held at a lakeside park, the kind with long picnic tables and tall trees offering shade. When I arrived, Leela spotted me immediately and rushed over, pulling me into a tight hug. "I'm so glad you came," she said, her voice warm and genuine. As the afternoon unfolded, something unexpected happened. People didn't whisper, they didn't pity me, They listened. They asked thoughtful questions, and when the topic of Daniel inevitably came up, there was no judgment in their eyes, only concern and respect for how I'd handled myself. At one point, my aunt pulled me aside. She was my mother's older sister, sharp-tongued but observant. "Your mother would have had words for that man," she said bluntly, "but she'd be proud of you." I laughed softly. She did have words. She just gave them to me ahead of time. Later, as the sun dipped lower and the lake reflected gold and orange, I sat on the edge of the dock alone. The air smelled like water and pine. I thought about how close I came to losing myself during that season of grief, how easily I could have signed those papers just to make the pain stop, how often women are conditioned to choose peace over justice, quiet over truth. I realized then that my story wasn't just about betrayal, it was about interruption. I interrupted a narrative that said grief makes you incapable. I interrupted a plan that relied on my silence. I interrupted a cycle that could have followed me for the rest of my life. A few weeks after the reunion, I received an email from someone I didn't know personally. She explained that she'd heard my story through the grief support group and wanted to thank me. Her husband had tried to pressure her into signing a postnuptial agreement while she was caring for her dying father. Hearing my experience made her pause, seek counsel, and ultimately protect herself. I read her message twice, then a third time. Tears blurred the screen. It humbled me in a way I wasn't prepared for. My pain hadn't been meaningless. It had become a warning light for someone else, a reminder that vulnerability should never be exploited. That night, I sat at my desk and wrote for hours, not for an audience, for myself. I wrote about the funeral, the envelope, the coldness in Daniel's voice. I wrote about Margaret's steady presence, about my mother's note, about the moment I realized I didn't need revenge to feel whole. I just needed my truth intact. As I wrote, another realization surfaced. Forgiveness, the real kind, isn't something you grant another person. It's something you reclaim for yourself when you're done carrying what doesn't belong to you. I forgave Daniel, not because he earned it, because I was finished letting his choices occupy space in my future. Around the same time, Daniel tried to reach out again. This time it was a voicemail. I listened once, then deleted it, not out of anger, out of clarity. There was nothing left to resolve. Closure had already happened, quietly and completely. People sometimes ask me if I'll ever remarry. I never answer quickly, not because I'm afraid, but because I respect the weight of the question now. Love, I've learned, isn't proven by endurance alone. It's proven by care in moments when it would be easier to choose convenience. If I ever share my life with someone again, it will be someone who understands that grief is not an inconvenience to work around, but a sacred space to honor. Someone who doesn't rush my pain or weaponize my vulnerability. Someone who sees strength not as something to dominate, but something to protect. On the anniversary of my mother's funeral, I returned to the cemetery. I brought fresh flowers and stood quietly, just as I had before, but this time felt different. The air felt lighter. I spoke to her aloud, telling her about the garden, the support group, the reunion, the woman who found courage because of our shared story. I didn't let him take advantage of me, just like you taught me. A breeze moved through the trees, gentle and reassuring. I smiled, feeling her presence not as loss, but as guidance. As I walked back to my car, I thought about how many people live with unfinished grief layered under unfinished betrayal, how many sign things they don't understand just to escape conflict, how many mistake exhaustion for consent. If my story reaches even one person standing at that crossroads, I want them to hear this clearly. You are allowed to pause. You are allowed to say no. You are allowed to ask for help. And you are absolutely allowed to protect yourself, even when the world expects you to be quiet. My husband served me divorce papers at my mother's funeral, believing that grief would make me small. Instead, it revealed the full measure of my strength, not loud, not vengeful, but steady, grounded, and unshakable. And that strength didn't just carry me through the worst moment of my life, it carried me forward into a future that finally belongs to me. By the third year after everything happened, the story no longer felt sharp at the edges. It had softened, like glass worn smooth by water. I could touch it without bleeding. That didn't mean I forgot. It meant I finally understood where the pain belonged in my life, not at the center, not as a warning siren, but as a chapter already lived. I noticed the shift one afternoon while sitting with a friend at a small cafe downtown. She was venting about her marriage, about how tired she felt, how unseen. I listened carefully, the way people listened to me when I was unraveling. At some point, she stopped and said, "You always seem so grounded now, like nothing rattles you." I smiled, stirring my tea. "Things rattle me," I said honestly. "I just don't let them knock me over anymore." That difference had taken time. It came from learning to trust my instincts again. For a long while after the divorce, I second-guessed myself constantly. I wondered how I missed the signs, how I loved someone capable of that kind of cruelty. Therapy helped me understand that trust doesn't fail because you're foolish. It fails when someone decides to break it. Responsibility belongs where the choice was made. I began mentoring women through the same grief support organization where I volunteered, not formally, just sitting with them, listening, sharing when it felt appropriate. One woman in particular stays with me. Her name was Nadia. She was newly widowed, still wearing her wedding ring, still speaking about her husband in the present tense. During one session, she whispered, "Everyone keeps telling me to be strong. I don't feel strong." I leaned toward her and said softly, "Strength isn't how you feel, it's what you keep doing, even when everything hurts." She cried then, openly, shoulders shaking, and I stayed. I didn't try to fix it. I didn't rush her grief. I understood now how rare that kind of presence is. Later that night, driving home, I realized how much I'd changed. I used to equate strength with endurance, silence, patience. Now I understood strength as discernment, as knowing when to stay and when to walk away, when to speak and when to protect your peace. The house had evolved with me. The walls held new art. The rooms echoed with laughter during dinners and quiet music on Sunday mornings. I kept my mother's letters in a small wooden box on a shelf, not hidden away, not treated like relics. They were part of my daily life. Sometimes I'd open one at random, letting her words guide me in moments of doubt. One letter in particular stood out. She wrote, "You don't owe anyone your suffering. Pain happens. Suffering is what we choose when we believe we deserve less." I sat with that sentence for a long time. I thought about how easily I'd accepted emotional scarcity in my marriage, how often I'd told myself, this is just how love is. It wasn't. It never was. One spring evening, I attended a small panel discussion on resilience and life transitions. I hadn't planned to speak. I was just there to listen. But during the Q&A, someone asked a question about betrayal during grief, about how to respond when life piles one loss on top of another. The moderator looked around, then at me. "Would you like to share?" she asked gently. I hesitated, then nodded. I didn't tell the whole story. I didn't need to. I talked about timing, about how betrayal hurts most when it comes at your weakest, and about how important it is to slow down when someone tries to rush your decisions. "When someone pressures you during grief," I said, my voice steady, "they're telling you they care more about their outcome than your well-being. Believe them." The room was silent, not uncomfortable, attentive. Afterwards, several people approached me quietly, thanking me, sharing pieces of their own stories. I drove home that night with a full heart, realizing that what once felt like the worst moment of my life had become a source of clarity for others. Daniel crossed my mind less and less. When he did, it wasn't with anger, it was with understanding. Not sympathy exactly, but perspective. I saw him now as someone who ran from discomfort his entire life, who chose expedience over empathy. That was his burden, not mine. One evening, I found myself cleaning out the last remaining box of things from the marriage: old photos, ticket stubs, a card he once wrote me, promising forever. I read it once, then folded it carefully and placed it in the recycling bin, not as an act of bitterness, but as a recognition that promises without action are just ink on paper. As I closed the box, I felt something settle: completion. People sometimes think closure comes from confrontation or apology. For me, closure came from alignment, from knowing my actions matched my values, from choosing dignity when humiliation would have been easier, from refusing to let grief be used as leverage against me. On the night before my birthday, I sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, watching the stars appear one by one. I thought about the woman I was the day my mother was buried, hollow, shocked, holding divorce papers with shaking hands. I wished I could reach back through time and tell her what I know now. I would tell her that she survives this, that she grows, that she finds joy again, not in spite of the pain, but because she refuses to let it define her. I would tell her that the lawyer walking into her life that day wasn't just a legal ally, she was the doorway back to self-respect. Most of all, I would tell her that the worst thing that happened wasn't the divorce, it was the attempt to strip her of agency during her grief, and that attempt failed. Because grief didn't silence me, it sharpened me. My husband served me divorce papers at my mother's funeral, believing it would end things cleanly in his favor. What he didn't understand is that grief has a way of clarifying what truly matters. It taught me that love without compassion is hollow, that partnership without respect is a contract waiting to break, and that my voice, even when trembling, was still powerful. This story isn't about revenge, it's about reclamation, of time, of dignity, of self-trust. And if you're listening to this while carrying both loss and betrayal, know this: you are not broken, you are in transition, and transitions, as painful as they are where truth finally rises to the surface. Mine did, and it changed everything. There's a moment that comes after you've survived something life-altering, when you realize the story no longer owns you, you own it. I didn't recognize that moment right away. It didn't arrive with clarity or certainty. It came quietly, disguised as an ordinary morning when I woke up without dread sitting on my chest, when the past felt like something I could carry instead of something dragging behind me. I was standing in the kitchen, sunlight pouring across the counter, when I noticed I was smiling for no particular reason. The coffee tasted good, the house felt peaceful, and for the first time, I wasn't bracing myself for anything. That's when I understood. I had crossed a line I didn't know existed. I wasn't healing anymore, I was healed enough. Grief doesn't disappear, it changes shape. My mother is still with me in unexpected ways, in the way I pause before making decisions, in the way I double-check details, in the way I speak up now even when my voice shakes. She didn't get to see how everything unfolded, but she left me prepared, and that preparation saved me when I didn't have the strength to save myself. I think often about that day at the cemetery, about the cold weight of the envelope in my hands, about how exposed and humiliated I felt, about how certain Daniel was that I would comply. That memory no longer hurts the way it used to, but it still teaches me something every time I revisit it. It reminds me how quickly people reveal their character when they believe you're powerless. I used to replay that moment wondering if I could have stopped it somehow, if I missed warning signs, if I should have known. But I've learned to stop asking myself questions that place responsibility where it doesn't belong. The truth is simple and uncomfortable. Some people choose convenience over compassion, and when they do, it's not your job to absorb the damage quietly. What I'm most proud of isn't that I won anything legally, it's that I didn't disappear. I didn't sign away my voice to avoid conflict. I didn't let grief become a muzzle. I stayed present, even when it would have been easier to shut down. That choice changed me permanently. I'm more discerning now. I listen carefully to how people treat me when I'm tired, when I'm overwhelmed, when I'm hurting. I no longer confuse charm with kindness or promises with integrity. I pay attention to patterns, not apologies, and I trust myself in a way I never did before. Sometimes people ask me if I hate Daniel. I don't. Hate requires energy I no longer give to people who've exited my life. I feel something closer to acceptance. Acceptance that he was who he was. Acceptance that I stayed longer than I should have. Acceptance that the ending was painful but necessary. And acceptance that I am not defined by how someone else chose to treat me. The house is quiet now in the best way. It feels lived in, not tense. I've hosted birthdays, holidays, small gatherings filled with laughter. I've sat alone on the couch with a book and felt complete instead of lonely. I've learned that peace isn't the absence of noise, it's the absence of fear. Every so often, someone new hears my story and reacts with outrage. How could he do that to you, they ask. I used to feel embarrassed, like his actions reflected something about me. Now I answer calmly. He did it because he thought he could. That's the part that matters. When someone believes you'll stay silent, they test the limits of what they can take. The moment you refuse, everything changes. That refusal doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need theatrics. Sometimes it's just a quiet no, a folded piece of paper returned unsigned, a phone call to someone who knows the law, a decision to pause instead of comply. That pause saved my future. If I could leave you with anything from this story, it's this. Your lowest moment is not an invitation for someone else to claim power over you. It is not a green light for manipulation. It is not proof that you're incapable of protecting yourself. Grief does not cancel your rights. Pain does not erase your intelligence. Love does not require self-betrayal. If someone pressures you to decide quickly while you're hurting, that urgency serves them, not you. Slow down, breathe, ask for help. You are allowed to take up space, even when you're brokenhearted. I didn't know I was capable of standing up for myself that day. I didn't feel strong. I felt shattered. But strength isn't something you feel before you act. It's something you discover afterward when you look back and realize you didn't collapse. I still visit my mother's grave from time to time. I tell her about my life, about the garden, about the people I've helped, about how her lessons carried me through the hardest moment of my life. I don't ask her why things happened the way they did anymore. I thank her for equipping me to survive them. There's a kind of peace that comes when you stop wishing the past were different and start honoring the person you became because of it. I honor the woman who didn't sign those papers, the woman who made the phone call, the woman who chose dignity over silence. My husband served me divorce papers at my mother's funeral, thinking it would end everything neatly in his favor. What he gave me instead was clarity, and clarity is powerful. It showed me that I deserved better. It showed me that I could protect myself. It showed me that even in grief I was not powerless. And now, standing firmly in the life I rebuilt, I know something with absolute certainty. The moment he thought would break me was the moment I finally began to stand.